Hello and welcome to the Preconceived podcast, where we are still asking the question, what are you thinking?
Part 2 of What Are You Thinking?
And specifically, we're talking about the documentary that we watched about Hillsong Church.
A Megachurch Exposed.
Yes, that's a great title. It tells you exactly what you want to know. But not just about Hillsong Church, because it would be easy just to focus on them without understanding that there are some things to be learned for the church at large.
Oh, without a doubt.
And so the question that I really want to ask on this episode is a church meant to be operated as a business?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's not a super easy question, because I think the first answer would be like, well, of course not. But when you get to the nitty gritty and the infrastructure and decision making, and I mean, then you get the whole administration and organization of it and what you do and like buying things, getting acquisitions, having people go different places. Yeah. There's a lot of things that could look exactly like a business on paper. Yeah. And what do you do in those situations? Yeah. How do you mold your church and have it not fall into the traps that we saw Hillsong falling in, you know?
And the bigger the church, the more likely it is that you're going to have some of those issues.
Yes.
And we saw that during this documentary, they spent a lot of time looking at Hillsong as being a business, as wanting to have this great reach, of wanting to have the ability to have influence in multiple locations and the best of the best when it came to sound and music and lighting and all of those things. Yeah. And on some of those areas, I tend to think, well, what's the problem with wanting to do things in excellence?
Exactly.
But anytime you're talking about tithes and offerings, people's money being given to the church, which ultimately we know are being given to God, you start to have questions on how is that money being spent?
Exactly.
And I think that's a very fair question.
I think so.
Because when we're watching the first couple episodes, I think it was episode 2, where the preachers and sneakers guy gets on there, and they're looking at, like, there's money being used on, I think there was motorized vehicles as well, but also on sneakers and clothing and that kind of stuff. That's, to me, where I would say, I don't think money from the church should be used on those things at all, when there is always going to be needs. But when we're talking about Christians, individuals coming into a church and being able to experience basically the worship service, hopefully the Spirit of God first and foremost, there is nothing wrong with pursuing excellence.
I totally agree. And it's when we get into these lines, right? And we have to really get to the foundation of these lines. It's when we get into the heart, right? Yeah. The whole heart of the issue. Exactly. And we don't have the ability to look at someone's heart. Yeah. We have only the ability to look on the outside, look at the fruits, look at specific things that we can then discern and make a judgment on, right? But God's the one that looks at the heart. Yeah. And so when we're looking at all these things and we're looking at, is Hillsong just about the brand, right? Which was a critique. Are they even a church? I think the guy at the end was like, they're not even a church. They're a business and a corporation, right? Like, they only care about making money, only care about influencing people, only care about being heard, you know? And when you're looking at that stuff, if you put it all on paper next to other places, even next to the Bible, you're like, certain things line up. Having influence lines up. Having and like being blessed monetarily lines up with scripture in the Bible in a lot of ways, right? Like building and influencing and the Great Commission of going out, right? A lot of things match up. Yeah. But when you get to the heart of the matter,
the heart is where it comes down to.
There a problem, and is their motivation to protect what their image is rather than their flock, which is one of the major things with a pastor.
No, you're right. The heart is what it comes down to, because then we start talking about private jets and all this, and it's like, that's where we really start to ask those questions. Right. And I guess the question becomes this, and this is going back to a personal experience that we've talked about. There was a time where we were doing a church service over the summer. There was a massive storm. Power went out in the middle of the service. So what we did was, naturally, we just closed everything down and we went home. Right. No. Of course
exactly.
Not. We continued to have... It didn't matter if we had a live stream, if we had music, if we had lighting, if we had any of those things.
Right. You had people.
We were there for God, and that was it. Yeah. And I would even venture to say, and I can't speak for anybody else, but that if you were to go to a Hillsong service and the lights went off and the live stream went down, they wouldn't just go home.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they're there for God.
That would be weird.
It doesn't mean there isn't dysfunction. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that should be adjusted and addressed. And we're going to talk about some of those things as they specifically pertain to Hillsong.
Really heartbreaking
stuff.
But
ultimately, what is the heart. And so when we're talking about church, and I think that's the most important thing, if it's to be run as a business, on some areas, in some ways, the answer is yes.
It has to be.
You need to be responsible. You need to be able to make sure that things are being spent properly, that there are budgets in place, that people are being paid. Now, and you said something else that I thought was very interesting. It doesn't matter sometimes a small church or a big church.
Yes.
I've been in small churches that did not have a lot of money, that were super dysfunctional.
Yes.
Just in the same way as you could talk about a Hillsong New York City.
Relationally, like down to what they teach, right? The size matters, but then at a certain level it doesn't, because you still have humans doing it. And I would venture to say, try making a church without any type of organizational business strategy or vision.
It might be exciting for a couple of weeks, but it's
you're gonna like, people are going to leave, because there is something that people crave, and it is structure on some level. No matter how free and free spirited you think you are, I don't fall in a box, right? Ultimately, you're going to want to be in a place that has some level of structure.
And a question for you, Mr. Bible historian, Old Testament, right? Was God structured in the Old Testament?
Oh my gosh. and I think that's people's issue with it today, when they look at it, it's like, oh, it's so structured. It's not, it's too religious.
And can we imagine that when they got to the New Testament, even when they were meeting in homes as churches, right? They came to them and they were talking about the widows and orphans being fed, and they set up a structure in place to be able to make sure those things were being taken care of.
Exactly. Administration is absolutely a gift that God gives. And having an ability to deal with numbers, to be organized, I think that falls under stewarding well. And I don't see a big difference between business and stewardship when it comes to having money, especially the bigger you get. You better have some complex software, complex minds thinking
systems
about where's money going to, how are people getting paid, how are we paying for the lights, how are we paying for all these different things.
So let's get to the critique of Hillsong, because on multiple levels, especially in the third episode, they were talking about the way that the church was set up as LLCs. They were talking about the different properties that Hillsong owned. They were talking about the different locations that they had globally. And they were speaking about it as if it was a bad thing. Going back to the initial statement that Brian Houston had made about the church. I see the church being a church of influence, being a church that has a global reach. And what the viewpoint of this documentary was, well, there's something wrong with that. And why? Why is there something wrong with the church believing in Jesus, going out and fulfilling the Great Commission and having reach in the world?
Again, there are two people talking. One, it sounded like people who are never Christians, who had never even heard of the whole concept that we should influence other people, right? And they have their own idea of church, and church is supposed to be this that you do sometimes, but it doesn't affect anything else besides people that want to go to church. And two, it sounded like people that were hurt. And they looked at it through the hurt lens, or the deconstructing lens, or the frustration lens, right? And regardless if they had actual issues with it, these two sides, when you're looking through these lenses, it's impossible to begin. It's impossible to not critique or fall into the critic cynical mode. When I hear multiple times when people have these awesome testimonies about how God gave them land, right? How God, if look at the Old Testament, the huge part of the Old Testament is about the Israelites getting land and God taking land from other people and giving it to them. And he's like, I'm treating you as my people, and I've gone and prepared a way and land. And then what was the connection to it? That the Israel would be blessings to other nations. So if we look at the church as Israel in the New Testament, we are in this sense, like, it's not bad to have land. It's not bad to have influence. It's not bad to grow. And I would expect...
And a desire to do so in the cities and in the places and the communities where you exist.
And I would expect fruit of you growing to the point that Hillsong has grown, right? To have influence or to have fruit.
It's interesting, and obviously this kind of speaks to, a megachurch being exposed, is that there was nothing that was spoken about in regards to their influence in the community.
No.
To any of the things.
There was not really anything good talked about at all.
There was nothing positive in it. And when we continue to look at the documentary, it begins to speak about the school and maybe the culture there. And that's where I really believe that this shift in thinking has to occur from business over to the place of we are the body of Christ.
That's a great point.
Because the culture that you have in place in your church, in your organization, whether it's a school or if it's an outreach or if it's a parachurch, is to walk in the example that Christ gave, to empower people, to love people, to not take advantage of them, to not quiet them, to not shame them for their past. And so that is some of what I believe the documentary was speaking to in regards to some of the students. Now, we don't know the full story.
Not at all.
We don't have both sides of what was going on.
We have 3 hours of a documentary.
Yes, and certain and just individuals that are, and I'm not doubting that some of the stories that these people were telling were true, but it was almost as if when they were talking about the school, they were critiquing Hillsong for doing a thorough background check for who the people were that were going to be working with children.
Huge.
Now, the structure could be good, and the culture can be bad. And if both things aren't working together, the business side of it and the spiritual side of it, then you are going to have an issue. And I think that's what was happening, or at least that's what was being reported to have happened in Hillsong's case.
Well, I like to think of it like you have a business. What's the human side of the business? It's the customer service, right? It's the people that interact with the customers. And that's obviously the biggest difference between a business, corporate business, and a church is that the customer service of a church it should be the main focus, right? It's how are you treating people? How are you coming off to people? And I think there are certain people that work those jobs that have the same attitude as whenever you go to customer service, right? They're like, what do you want? What, like, I can't help you, you know? And so sometimes you have those people who are, that's just, I think, a personality. I think a certain amount of people that get there. And so when you're telling them stuff, they might be super short, like might be a little cutting. They might be really organized and they're just not warm and fuzzy, right? And to turn that into this huge issue, right? Like it's certain people like, I didn't feel comforted. I didn't feel this way or that way. That's where it gets really muddy. To get really muddy with people saying my feelings weren't taken care of and then using that to create a bigger point against it, I think happened a lot in the documentary.
I have 2 things though. One is that sometimes people are babies.
Yes.
Okay? Sometimes people don't know what it is to serve and to be inconvenienced.
I think that's a huge part.
And I know in my life, I know in your life, being parts of churches that were church plants and just we didn't have our own buildings or even ones that did, there is a level of service that is required to run a church. Not everybody is going to be paid for those positions, and it is important that we are willing to give of ourselves. Now, that can be abused.
Without a doubt.
The second thing I'll say is that there are people sometimes that are more, their personalities are not very warm and comforting, and they are just trying to get things done. However, I would say that would require a perspective shift. And it always comes from the top down.
I agree.
And so if your people who are carrying out the task of organizing the people and speaking to the people are not the right people.
That's a great point.
You got to deal with that.
You should do something about that.
And number 2, if you're treating them with the responsibility of get this job done, set these chairs up, make sure everything is perfect, make sure the VIP section, if you're in Hillsong, New York City, is ready to go for Justin Bieber and whoever else is coming in. If that is the mentality, more so than, hey, are you okay? Like, we got to get this done, but it seems to me like you're going through something right now. Can we just talk for a moment? Can I pray for you maybe? Instead of, get this done, production.
That's the corporate mindset. I think
that's where business has to be cut off from culture.
Absolutely. And I think stress doesn't just appear in someone.
Yeah.
You know, if a mid-level manager who's dealing with all of the volunteers is stressed, I don't think it just appeared in there. No. I think it was I think it's top down, especially from the top of the pressure, maybe of the Brian Houstons of the world's on the shoulder. So it gets like, we have to tighten things up, then tighten things up, and then tighten things up. And then it does begin to fall into that corporate mindset where you're squeezing every minute, every dollar, every hour of every volunteer. And then it becomes a culture. And because it's habitual. It happens over and over and over again. That's when you have the people that are like, I was wronged, or I'm hurt, and I'm going to dye my hair blue because it's going to be a picture of my freedom from the structure that I've been formed under. And I don't know if I would have survived. I think one said, I don't know if I would have survived if I stayed in that culture. And I'm like, how much?
The extremity that you went to, the extreme that you went to say, I think I would have died. And I'm like, well, that's a dramatic line for a documentary. But
it was great for the documentary.
I'm sure they were like, oh, that was gold. But yes.
Can you say it again with a tear falling down?
Yes, exactly. If not, we'll superimpose it. We'll make sure we have the right angle. Because yes, in all of this, once again, we can reiterate it. There was a purpose for making the documentary. And the documentary would not have been popular. It could not have been marketed if it was how great Hillsong is.
Right. And they just made a little mistake.
Yes, exactly.
They had a few issues.
So let's talk about for a second I guess I have a question in this. Do we believe that Hillsong, in the structure that was put in place, the model, to be able to have businesses or business model, we're going back to business for a second, but to have this vision to have churches throughout the globe on different continents, that ultimately in the beginning, it was a very good strategy, but at some point in the process, there was something that poisoned the well, so to speak. Because we know there's some accusations in this documentary that start to show, okay, if there is this amount of stress and pressure on the organization, that almost has to filter through and actually taint something that could have been good.
Nothing remains untouched. And so I want to go back to Acts, right? The Acts church. Before we had the Reformation, before we had splitting off of different churches of the Eastern Orthodox and the High Catholic Church and all these different things, and now we have denominations and different churches, right? Like we have the AG denomination, and you have Hillsong and Bethel, like have different campuses and the spreading. The church, there are a lot of different churches. As they began to spread, people began to form churches, local bodies in their communities, right? That, I believe, what we're dealing with now is the culmination of that initial idea, which is that churches would spring up in different communities. It just didn't have a Hillsong, and this is they had different names, obviously, but you didn't call the Church of Pergamum, right? The Church of Pergamum when it was in like somewhere else, Thyatira, or it was in Rome, you know, like I'm saying, or in North America.
It wasn't have a cool name like Fire Church,
right?
Like, you know,
it wasn't that, right? So it wasn't like the Church of Philadelphia was in like South Africa.
It was just the church.
It was the church. The church spread, right? So in that sense, being a church and wanting to spread other churches and build other churches with and having that business that business mindset, that vision for that. I think is very biblical.
And Paul was aware of the churches he planted.
Apostles, the whole concept of the apostles.
To these churches. He was constantly in communication. That was a church network.
There's a reason why they call it the arm of the church. It's like that's the evangelist and the apostle area of it, is that there are supposed to be people that spring up and they plant churches and they plant places for local Christians to be part and to group and to build in their faith and then to live. And church is an idea that it's eternal, right? And I think we'll be in local churches until we die, you know? And so that's how it's meant to be. We're supposed to have fellowship in that area. So I think for someone to look at that church and be like, it's wrong for you to want to spread and to create other churches, I think fundamentally is flawed, because that's what the early church did. They just didn't have the different names. It wasn't like Paul's church is here and then Paul's church is also millions of miles away, right? It was the church is spreading, you know?
For sure. And I think that is definitely, like you said, it's biblical. And there shouldn't be, and they talked about the 7 mountain mandate, and they talked about it in such a negative sense, and like there was this global occupation where the Christians were going to violently take a hold of every one of these places. Listen, I am very much in favor of the 7 mountain mandate. In understanding that we as Christians should not just be centrally focused in our own little club, but that we should be desiring to influence given the gifts that God has put on our life. To be able to be involved in media, to be able to be involved in entertainment and family and education and business and finance, and to be able to be in these places and to bring the light that God has put on us. But if you listen to this documentary, it's like, oh yeah, they subscribe to this 7 mountain mandate and it's so evil.
Exactly. No. That's the megachurch being exposed. They want to be in everything. You know, it's exposed. It's like silly.
It's kind of like they were saying, like, church, stay in your lane. You be the church. Don't try to influence anything else.
What are you doing?
And like, wait. This is not the way the church has been throughout history. And maybe at times there have been things where the church has done things in the wrong way, for sure. And it's been looked at as this negative entity, and it just needs to stay over here. But we truly believe that when Jesus said, go out into all the world and make disciples, that he then gave us wisdom and strategy on how to be able to reach people. How do we reach people in today's day and age? We reach them through media, through technology, we want to start with our families. We want to be able to have income coming in through the business world to be able to affect and bless people. All of this comes from what Jesus showed us to do.
Exactly. And I think even in that sense, it's that we have church and we have this whole concept of church and what it's supposed to be. And sure, there are moments where it can totally fall into, you're doing it just to make money. And especially when you get more and more money, that why are you doing it? Why are you influencing people? And then people get lost. But the nature of trying to spread this thing, and this is, if you want to also hear like the little narrative, and I was talking to you this before, it definitely sounded like they were trying to put the label of imperializer, colonizer, all these buzzwords that are totally the you're evil if you think this way, right? You're evil if you go and you impose yourself on different cultures and you get rid of representation matters, all this different stuff. You could tell when they were like, the church wants to spread, that was the label that they're slapping on them. Like Hillsong, you want to colonize, you want to go and you want to get into people's business and you want to spread the news of Hillsong over them and you want to take them over and influence them, right? And that's the area where I find myself like, that is such a narrative and such an agenda, but Christians should desire that all people on the earth would be touched and be influenced in a way. And how does God do that? He does do it through, there are individuals who do that and they touch people, and you have crusades and good
crusades.
Good crusades. Well, I mean,
not the crusades.
We should, I mean, next season we'll talk about the crusades, and they, part of them were justified, but we'll get into the history of that. But you'd have like these saves, like
drop a bomb over here.
I know, it's great. That's why you should stay tuned. The nature of like having people and touching people, but also God does it through the church. That's why churches are planted, is to group the people in. So you can tell that they want you to think pejoratively about the concept of influencing, because they want you to stay small, they want you to stay behind and not grow in that sense, you know?
No, for sure. And I think that's really, if you're just looking at whatever negative things you could throw against Hillsong, that was a convenient narrative to be able to throw against them from people who were not part of the church, from people who had been to a church service or had been aware of them because they were in the same area.
Yes.
Now, this is the part where we have to shift a little bit, though, because when we're talking about being run as a business or being run as a church, right? In a business, there are certain things that are acceptable for you to be able to deal with issues, maybe in-house, not to talk about, abuse like this, right? But just in general, there are certain things that they're handled a certain way. When it comes to the church, though, transparency does matter.
It does matter.
And that is what we saw as the biggest fault of what was being brought against Hillsong that was legitimate. And I believe that they have owned up to in a lot of ways. But it's one of those things that you're never really going to be able to escape the truth of what happened. And so if you're not aware, if you haven't watched the documentary, a large part of what it came down to and ultimately Brian Houston stepping away from Hillsong
resigning,
was that there was allegations that turned out to be true and substantiated.
Multiple. That
Brian Houston's father, Frank Houston, had molested at least one young child, and I think there was reports of more. They talked
about 14 others that were saying that it happened. I don't know if they've been proven, but they're alleged.
And Frank Houston, before he passed away in the early 2000s, had admitted to this and had spoke to say this was what had happened.
Right.
And so it is fact. But then this was covered over. It wasn't brought to light. Yes, they paid the victim to keep his mouth shut. Eventually, he did come forward, and there was a civil suit at least, but I think an actual lawsuit brought against the church because of the way they handled it. Right. And Brian Houston himself did admit to not bringing this to light the way he should have.
Sure.
In mandatory reporting.
Sure.
So this is the situation now that we find Hillsong in, and the ramifications of it are huge. And there are certain things that people will forgive you for, so to speak, when it comes to maybe there was this individual who spent money in the wrong way, or maybe you didn't have the best of intentions when you fired somebody.
It's much easier to forgive and to be able to bring them back to some kind of place of like, I'm sorry I did this, and being brought back in a sense.
But when it comes to child abuse and victimization of children,
it's so difficult.
And for us, even watching that part of the documentary, it makes your stomach turn, and
so
it makes you. It brings up anger inside of me, if I'm honest, to hear about any of these things. And the fact of the matter is that it happened. It was reported to a certain extent. We can talk about the mom's reaction because that was significant.
Super sad.
And then the cover up really for many, many years.
Yep.
And really, it looks like he was allowed to continue to keep ministering even after they acknowledged and pulled him out, that he still had some speaking engagements that...
Yeah, definitely while it was happening. And then I think later, a few years before he died... Because
they had a recording.
And that was documentary making gold, because it totally fit into the entirety of what they were saying. Yeah. And whether he was just being an old man or he was being very creepy, the way he was talking definitely was indicative of someone who was messing around with children. Yeah. Right. And so the nature of that, especially when we also hear like it's happening with the Catholic Church a lot with priests, right? And even things like in school, right? With the Nasser whole like Olympic team and like sexual allegations against Sandusky, that, and the Sandusky and what happened to Joe Paterno was the biggest thing, was that he knew about it and even tried to do something about it, but didn't do enough and didn't let the authorities know. And so that's college athletics is a business, right? That's a business and makes sense for a business who's not really concerned about people to close ranks, to make sure it never gets out, to pay people off. I think he gave him $10,000. Like Frank gave him $10,000, which is also when I was like, wow, really? This is how much we've been like, in nowadays, where I'm like, I feel like that's at least a few million, right? Or a few 100,000. But that was like back then. In those days, 10,000 was.
And the thing is, with a victim of those things, they are generally not somebody who wants to make a big deal about it because of the shame that they feel. Which is and then they take advantage of that by just paying them off, and it's sick. The entire thing, honestly, is sickening that it was allowed to happen, and it was done so in a business mindset to keep their stock high. Also, Brian Houston, it's his father. Like that is an incredibly has to be gutting to think about how to deal with it.
Biggest tests to this man you look up to, who you've been with, and you probably had no idea, or like then this to happen. Yeah. I can only imagine the amounts of reactions that are coming to you. But what we've seen, and this is like a lesson learned, there is a right way, I think, to bring it up and to let it out. Like, I don't think you just go to like a news tabloid and be like, hey, by the way, my father is molesting kids. But what we found is whenever you try to hide it, you lose more credibility with the people around you than when you humbly admit it was happening.
Because look what happened ultimately. Yeah. Their stock price on who Hillsong was is plummeting now, where churches are pulling out of the network because of the way they handle it.
And they had, Brian Houston swearing on the Bible and giving the deposition and everything. Like, at the end of the documentary, they say like he could face 5 years in jail for if he's convicted of hiding it, right? Yeah. So the nature of this is like, as hard as that is, and I would never wish that situation on anyone, to have to take their father and confess what he did, even to get to that spot. But it's worse when you hide it. Yeah. It's worse when you don't let it go, and then the victim's mother being like, "Don't harm the church because you don't want to be the reason why the church shuts down, and then people can't be saved." Yeah. And then the whole issue of him saying the community wasn't around him. The community,
to a terrible culture.
Yeah, the community needs to be around the victim, and I hope that comes through when we're talking about these two things. There's the two lines you get, whether it's like, I think there are victims that are not victims at all, but then there are also victims who are very much victims.
There's a difference between a victim mentality and a victim.
And
this was speaking about victims
and being worked and feeling like you're being worked too hard, or you don't have enough free time, and then molesting of a child, abuse, right? Yeah. Abuse. So the community, I think, even in both situations, the community should come around and find out what happens and not try to protect the brand, quote unquote, right? Yeah. Which I think is super valuable, and that's a lesson for everyone. But also the transparency you were talking about. I think he would have been so much better off. Yeah. They might have taken a hit in the media, but I think they would have kept a lot of trust in people who are leading it now.
And then the weight that he carried and the situations that ultimately led to his resignation, which was inappropriate texting of a coworker or somebody in the organization, and ending up in a hotel room, which he said he was mixing alcohol and medication, drugs, and to deal with a lot of the stress that he was going through.
Sure.
I mean, you can only imagine all of the stress of all of that. I mean, I think being the senior leader of a large organization like that has to come with so much stress anyway. But then when you have those things buried away that are eating at you, it's amazing in some ways that it continued as long as it did without becoming this getting to the point we're at right now. But this comes back to a couple of things we've talked about through the different episodes. It's you got to deal with your stuff. And that means that transparency, vulnerability, to be able to speak with people. And so ultimately when we talk about should the church be a business, our answer is yes, up until the place where your heart is now being shifted towards profit,
absolutely,
towards image,
right,
towards identity, instead of the heart of God for people, which is exactly why the church exists. The body of Christ is meant to be there. And so there's a lot of valuable lessons for us to be able to learn through this documentary.
Yeah.
So I really appreciated the time to be able to watch it and to discuss it. And we're going to have a lot of more awesome things to talk about in the future. This is actually the last episode of this season.
Of season
two, technically.
Technically season 2.
But we're going to be bringing it back in a few weeks' time. So in the meantime, we have a couple of requests of topics to cover. Yes. We're going to do that. Things might look a little differently. Yeah. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen, to watch. And we ask that you would just like, subscribe, share. Go back and watch some episodes that you missed. But we appreciate you. I pray you have an awesome week and a few weeks until we see you next.